Discover the amazing journey of a Jehovah's Witness grandma as she fights for justice and EXP. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, the morning sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. But it wasn't the beauty of the day that caught her heart, it was the unopened box in front of her. For years, it had lain forgotten, lurking in the shadows of the attic, filled with memories of laughter and warmth, all tangible remnants of Tom's love. With trembling fingers, she unclasped the lid, and the musty smell of old paper wrapped around her like an old blanket. Little did she know that the simple act of nostalgia would soon plunge her into a storm of despair and anger, igniting a long-dormant fire. As Eleanor sifted through photographs and trinkets from a life shared, her fingers brushed against something surprising, a letter. Unfolding it slowly, she was met with words that could shatter the fragile facade of her peaceful life. Tom's former colleague had penned a cryptic warning about a conspiracy within the school system, hinting at a tangled web of deceit that had led to her husband's undoing. Panic surged in her chest, a fierce pulsing reminder of the agony she'd endured, the wrongful accusations that had driven Tom to despair and his untimely death. Fear clutched at her heart. What if this letter contained the key to exposing the truth? Or what if it opened old wounds so deep they could never heal? Eleanor's mind raced. Would unveiling the secrets destroy the only peace her family had fought to reclaim? Any possibility of retaliation, of dragging out the memories, paralyzed her. The world outside seemed to fade, trapped in a silent vacuum as shadows of her anguish crawled back into her thoughts. Before we continue, I need to tell you about something important that's happening. YouTube has been making changes to the system and many people are losing notifications from channels they follow. If you're enjoying the content, click the bell and mark all notifications so you don't miss the next videos. And if you can leave a like, it really helps with reach. Seriously, it makes a difference. Oh, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know who's on the other side of the screen. Now let's continue. Each night, Eleanor wrestled with the truth, knowing she could either remain silent or summon the bravery inherited from years of spiritual resilience. The weight of her family's history pressed painfully on her chest. Eleanor felt like she was standing at a crossroads, caught between her unwavering faith and the desperate need for justice. Could she betray Tom's memory by unearthing secrets that would upset the quiet lives of others? With every ounce of her being, she hated the thought of being dismissed, of her pain being minimized. As she prepared for the upcoming school board meeting, her heart started to drum a frantic rhythm. The echoes of doubt splashed against her resolve as she envisioned confronting those figures who had cast shadows over her family's name. What if they only laughed her out of the room? The doubt twisted inside her like a knife, especially when she thought of her grandchildren, their youthful eyes now watching her closely. They had always seen her as a rock, reliable, loving, but she feared they would see her as something else entirely, a woman fighting a losing battle, one that could drag them into the mud, too. And as the day of reckoning drew closer, Eleanor clenched her fists in determination. She would no longer be the invisible heart of a family, a quiet follower of faith. The daughter of a man wronged long ago could rally together to confront the demons of the past. But just as her resolve solidified, she felt the suffocating grip of fear tighten around her once more. What hidden truths awaited her? The clash of justice and vulnerability swirled violently within her, and as she stood poised on the brink, everything shuddered with uncertainty, an irreversible change brewing on the horizon. The morning of the school board meeting arrived with a heavy humidity that settled over Eleanor like a cloak. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her blazer, a flimsy barrier against the storm brewing inside her. Each bead of sweat felt like a droplet of doubt, each breath a reminder of the stakes involved. Drawing a deep breath, she glanced toward the framed photo of Tom hanging on the wall, his warm smile always capable of grounding her. Today, he felt a million miles away, leaving her solely responsible for not only her family's legacy but for unearthing the truth of his tragic end. This weight felt unbearable, yet Eleanor understood that bearing it was her only path toward liberation. As she drove to the meeting, the realism of her situation pressed down like the clouds threatening rain. Every turn of the wheel seemed to echo her internal deliberations. Should she speak up? Should she expose the darkness hidden within the walls of the institution that had stolen her husband's dignity? What if the consequences tore her family apart? Arriving at the school, Eleanor parked in the lot, its familiarity combining with an unsettling recognition of how much had changed. Students filed past her, and while they laughed and joked among themselves, Eleanor's heart felt heavy with a different kind of gravity, the kind born from loss and a long-held desire for truth. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, filled with murmurs and laughter, so contrasting to the heaviness that dwelled inside her. She moved to the back of the room, her heart racing as the clock ticked louder with each passing second. The chairs were filled with parents, educators, and a handful of board members, all of whom were unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the podium. Her eyes searched for familiar faces, someone who might offer a nod of support, but they were lost in a sea of indifference. It cut deeper than she expected. The validation she so desperately needed felt fleeting, teasing her away from the confidence she had fought to build. When it was finally her turn to speak, she slowly rose, her legs trembling as she made her way to the front. The board chair's eyes, filled with polite acknowledgement, sparked with an unexpected flicker of challenge. Suddenly, the warmth of her memories and the weight of her fears coalesced into a singular moment of clarity. Eleanor remembered the countless times faith had guided her actions, reminding her that silence often fosters more harm than truth. "Thank you for allowing me to speak," she began, her voice steady but soft. "I'm here today because my husband was wronged within your system. I've come to share what I know about the corruption that led to his death." As the words spilled from her lips, she felt the tingling rush of empowerment drown out her fear. The murmurs in the room shifted, some intrigued, others dismissive. Yet Eleanor pressed on, laying out the pieces of the letter, detailing Tom's experiences, and invoking the real human cost of the decisions made behind closed doors. But as she spoke, a chill crept in, cold as the hollow gazes from a few board members who squirmed in their seats. She could feel the tension like a taut string ready to break. Were they merely bracing for another unfortunate account or preparing to retaliate? Just as she built momentum, her courage began to waver. What if she was viewed as nothing more than a grieving widow with an agenda? The self-doubt crept back, her thoughts turned chaotic as she braced for the fallout. Would her attempts at transparency lead to another loss, this time of respect among those she loved, or worse, a backlash that could put her family in danger? As she concluded her statement, a smattering of applause pierced the room, a lifeline in her sea of uncertainty. Yet before she could feel the warmth of validation fully, an older board member rose, an air of authority surrounding him. His sharp gaze sliced through her resolve as he uttered words that took the ground from beneath her. "The truth you seek is rarely as clear-cut as you might hope. Are you truly prepared for what you might uncover next?" Eleanor's heart raced as she was left rattling in the wake of his challenge. Now, she stood at yet another crossroads, with an undeniable choice looming before her. Would she pursue the truth, no matter where it led, or retreat into comfortable silence? The answer nudged her, urging her to step back into the storm rather than shy away. Determined to face whatever lay ahead, she scolded herself for letting fear take the lead. But as she turned to leave the podium, the openness of her heart filled with dread once more, knowing true justice required the courage to confront one's own darkness. What would Eleanor discover about her own strength in the days that followed? And as shadows of the past loomed ever closer, would she have the bravery to face them? Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she walked from the podium, the room still buzzing with conversation, but all she could hear was the rush of her own thoughts. The board members' words replayed in her mind, chilling and haunting. She stepped into a quiet corner, her breath hitching as the reality of her decision washed over her. She had stepped into the ring, and the fight had only just begun. Days passed, but the meeting continued to echo through her thoughts. Eleanor immersed herself in reflection, analyzing every comment, every expression she had witnessed. With each iteration, new layers of resolve wrapped around her like an armor. Determined to shift her perspective from that of a victim to that of a warrior, she began plotting her next moves. Starting with gathering evidence. Eleanor spent hours sifting through Tom's belongings, searching for clues that could aid her investigation. Among the piles of papers, she found old appointments and correspondence that hinted at a web of neglect surrounding his treatment at the school. With each document, a new piece of the puzzle emerged, igniting her passion for uncovering the truth. This woman, once trapped by her grief, was becoming an investigator on a mission. However, as she dove deeper into her research, self-doubt started to creep back in. What if she was wrong? What if everything Tom experienced was a misunderstanding? Still, with determination coursing through her veins, she pressed on, refusing to let uncertainty shackle her. In moments of quiet, when the world around her faded away, she took solace in the realization that feeling fear didn't mean she wasn't capable of courage. She reached out to former colleagues of Tom, crafting letters laced with a genuine plea for insight. They, too, had witnessed the systemic issues, but few dared to speak out. In one exchange, a former employee responded, revealing a grave incident that had been swept under the rug, validating Eleanor's gut feeling of injustice. The vulnerability she shared in her correspondence fostered reluctant trust, and slowly, she built a small support network, each interested in seeing that no voice went unheard. As her inquiries bore fruit, Eleanor felt emboldened. She attended local meetings for families affected by the school's policies, absorbing their stories, intertwining their struggles with her own narrative. Each account invigorated her, painting a clearer picture of a shared fight against disregard. But as she gathered momentum, she stumbled upon conflicting evidence. It tied certain board members to financial misconduct, hidden within the bureaucratic framework she was just beginning to understand. Eleanor felt the weight of this information pressing heavily upon her. Could she really expose such corruption? What if they retaliated against her or her family? The board had already viewed her with disdain, the whispers from the recent meeting still fresh in her mind. In her strategic thinking, Eleanor recognized something critical. These challenges were the very fire she needed to sharpen her resolve. It dawned on her that being afraid did not equate to weakness. Rather, it could be a source of power, fuel for her fight. The adrenaline surging through her was not just fear, it was the stirring of purpose. With newfound clarity, she started crafting her strategy. It involved not just laying bare the school's intentions, but also focusing on the stories of those affected. Sharing their narratives would build a coalition that couldn't easily be dismissed. Fueled by her desire for justice, Eleanor was repositioning herself from just a grieving widow to a formidable advocate. The night before her next meeting with the board, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Was she doing the right thing? The weight of responsibility pressed heavily, but beneath it all, a fire ignited. The truth needed a voice, and Eleanor was ready to be that voice, one that would echo through the halls of power, defying the silence that had so long lingered. The next day, she arrived at the school not as a shadow of her former self, but as a determined force. As she stood again in front of the board members, Eleanor knew she was not just representing herself but all those who had suffered under the system. Just as she was about to begin, the door swung open. A figure she never expected to see walked in, their presence sending ripples of shock across the room. Her heart leapt into her throat. The unexpected could change everything. Could this be the ally she so desperately needed, or a harbinger of more chaos? Eleanor's breath caught as the figure stepped into the room, and for a moment, time felt suspended. The familiar face, Dave, Tom's old mentor, stood before her, exuding an aura of authority that made the board members shift instinctively. She remembered his unwavering support for Tom during his darkest days, the fierce advocate for students whose voices had been silenced. Yet, here he was, an unexpected variable in her already precarious equation. "Dave," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. The board members murmured among themselves, confusion mingling with curiosity. She dared to hope that his presence might tilt the scales in her favor. "Eleanor," he replied, expression earnest and grave. "I heard what happened at the last board meeting. I know you have concerns about the school's policies." His gaze flickered to the board members, their discomfort palpable. "And I can't remain silent any longer." Instantly, Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude, a shared understanding strumming between them. Dave was ready to stand with her, but she also sensed the enormity of what they were about to confront together. This was not just about her and the school, it was about every family caught in a cycle of negligence. What could they accomplish if united? She motioned for him to sit beside her. The board's expressions shifted from skepticism to apprehension as they braced for an unexpected alliance that could shift their power dynamics. "Your voice matters, Dave," she encouraged, feeling her own resolve solidifying. "These stories need to be told." As Eleanor laid out her research and findings, she felt the energy in the room shift. Voices once drowned by the board's authority began to echo in her mind. They were not merely statistics, they were people with stories that deserved to be heard. With Dave's support, she initiated a discussion that examined patterns of misconduct. For every story she shared, he added details from his own experience, a testament to the system's failures. "Together we can shine a light on the truth," he said passionately. Eleanor felt herself rising to the weighty challenge, the adrenaline coursing through her as the board squirmed uncomfortably under the growing scrutiny. This was no longer just her fight, it was a collective mission, a beacon of justice against an oppressive silence. But a knot still twisted in Eleanor's gut. She couldn't lean entirely into the momentum without recognizing the potential backlash. The board could retaliate, striking back in ways that would harm her and her family. Yet, as she scanned the room at the previously dismissive board members, she questioned the morality of her hesitation. Was the risk too great? Or was her fear a barrier she needed to shatter? Eleanor pondered her next words carefully, aware that once she spoke, there would be no turning back. "This isn't just about the past, it's about a future that respects every child. If the school cannot guarantee that, we cannot, in good conscience, allow this cycle to continue." Their gazes bore into her, a mixture of disdain and a hint of respect. Eleanor could feel the tide turning slightly, but it was far from a victory. Just then, a board member leaned forward, his voice coated with skepticism. "You're creating chaos where there is none. You're being misguided." Eleanor's heart raced. She had prepared for denial, but his words stung, forcing her into a moment of indecision. This was the moment a revelation of her own capabilities as an advocate. "I find the chaos in your refusal to acknowledge the truth," Eleanor countered, defiance lighting her voice. There it was, her voice growing stronger, fortified by her purpose. "I will not allow fear to dictate my actions any longer." As she faced the board members, a desperate resolve blanketed her doubts. The room was alive with tension, an unspoken confrontation cloaked within corporate decorum. But this was only the beginning, she could sense it. Dave's presence beside her ratified the alliance, of sorts, but Eleanor was acutely aware that deeper battles loomed ahead. Would they truly unite in the face of adversity, or would the ensuing pressure reveal fractures in their newfound partnership? What if they lost everything in the attempt to pursue justice? She took a deep, steadying breath. The stakes had risen, and the impending confrontation felt insurmountable, but she was ready to face whatever came next. As Eleanor glanced at Dave, determination shining in his eyes, she knew they would venture forth together. Yet deep down, the question niggled, would they break into the light of truth, or would they plunge deeper into the shadows of betrayal? The stakes of this fight were higher than ever, and the next step might make or break them both. The time had come to face not only the board but the very foundation of their convictions. Eleanor felt the weight of the boardroom stairs as she stood at the precipice of this moment. Each heartbeat echoed her resolve. She was terrified yet invigorated, caught between her fears and the clarity of her mission. The tension was thick, she could almost touch the heavy air swirling around them, suffocating yet electrifying. With her newly forged ally beside her, Eleanor's mind raced through potential strategies. How could they wield their newfound partnership effectively? This wasn't just an argument to prove a point, it was the fate of the students who looked to them for answers. The faces of those children floated in her consciousness, a driving force revitalizing her purpose. Eleanor, Dave interrupted her internal whirlwind. His voice cut through the thick atmosphere with urgency. Your research, every story you've gathered, we must use them. We can transform them into undeniable evidence. She nodded, grateful for his directness. Yes, but we have to craft it carefully. They'll twist every word against us if we're not precise. Her mind concocted a plan. This wasn't mere advocacy, it was a tactical operation. The board members, having witnessed the confrontation ripple through the room, exchanged whispers, unease etched into their expressions. Eleanor sensed their vulnerability, their authority built on silence was now threatened, and she intended to exploit that. We can create a dossier, she suggested, her words laced with determination. Documenting every instance of misconduct and negligence. Make it impossible for them to ignore. Dave's eyes lit up. And we can present it in their next meeting, demanding accountability for the failures that have persisted for too long. Excitement flickered through her. This was the essence of moral advocacy. But a chill crept back in as the potential repercussions loomed overhead. What would happen once they crossed this line? Would the board retaliate fiercely, launching their own campaign to undermine her credibility? That single question surged like a tide, threatening to wash away her courage. Eleanor forced herself to focus. Doubt had crept in more often than she cared to admit, but this time it had to be faced head-on. We need to remain cautious and calculated. I can't risk our family's safety. Dave nodded, his brow furrowed with understanding. We'll be strategic, Eleanor. But we cannot allow fear to still our voices. This is about the children, everything else should come second. Her heart quickened at the gravity of his words. While his resolve bolstered her, self-doubt crept in. Had she done enough? Was she truly capable of leading this charge? Memories of previous rejections and failures gnawed at her. She took a breath, locking her gaze with Dave's. We can't retreat. Not now. Reassured, Eleanor began drafting the framework for a compelling narrative. Every account she had gathered transformed into a powerful testament, each child now a silent champion ready to speak through their stories. She felt the flicker of hope reignite within her. Maybe they would stoke a fire of change in that boardroom. They needed to know, she needed to show this could no longer be ignored. Yet even as she plotted the next tactical move, an unsettling thought skated across her mind. What if Dave grew weary of this fight? What if, overwhelmed by the responsibility, he turned back? The weight of her reliance on him was suffocating, an anchor she had never intended to sew into their alliance. I just want you to know, she said. If at any moment you feel this is too much, we can step back. I don't want to jeopardize your standing or put you in an uncomfortable position. Dave leaned in, his voice resolute. Eleanor, I have no intention of stepping back. We are in this together. You must trust that the fight is worth it. Trust. The concept swirled tightly around her heart, both a comfort and a knife's edge. What lay ahead would not only test her resilience but potentially fracture the bond she had come to value so dearly. As she turned her thoughts back to the impending confrontation, the plan began to crystallize. Yet a deeper uncertainty gnawed at her spirit. Would the truth be enough to bring about the change they so desperately sought? Or would it crumble under the weight of the established order? This would not merely be a movement against a simple authority, it was a revolution of courage, and Eleanor was poised to be at its helm, or was she? With her resolve rekindled, she prepared to face the moments that would define her next actions. The confrontation awaited, and uncertainty loomed large, but Eleanor was ready to chase the flicker of justice, ready to discover what awaited them both in their battle for truth. The next meeting would be the ultimate test of their fortitude. How far would they go to protect the vulnerable, and at what cost? Eleanor's fingers curled around the cold steel of her laptop, its screen casting a dim glow onto her face. She could see her reflection, the uncertainty etched in her brow juxtaposed against the determination in her gaze. Every moment since she made her pact with Dave churned inside her an exhilarating whirlpool of purpose and anxiety. She had known this moment would arrive, but the reality felt heavier than she'd envisioned. In the quiet of her small office, she focused on the foundation of their plans. Each individual story she had collected became both an anchor and a catalyst, fueling her resolve. The narratives of students, marginalized voices that had long been overshadowed, needed to rise to the surface. But she couldn't shake the discomfort fluttering deep in her chest. The task ahead was momentous, and her fear of failure whispers gnawed at every confident thought she tried to embrace. Eleanor found herself pacing the carpet, measuring her steps with the rhythm of her racing thoughts. The stakes were high. This meeting could pivot them towards either justice or destruction. She needed to reassure herself that the truth was on her side, yet the haunting dread of igniting the board members' wrath loomed large. What if I'm not enough? She muttered, collapsing onto the edge of her desk. The questions echoed, lingering like a portent. In moments such as these, self-doubt was a loud adversary. It struck at her conviction, and she grappled with its shadow. She had fought so hard to reach this point. Preparing for the confrontation would require bones of steel, and here she was, trembling at the thought of facing the board again. She glanced at the pile of documents she'd assembled, each representing a child's experience, their silent outcry transforming into words demanding accountability. Her heart clenched. How could she possibly showcase their pain without being overwhelmed by the enormity of what was at stake? Memories swirled around her mind, recollections of battles fought long ago. The moments she had stood up and advocated for students, and those times when silence felt like the safer choice crashed over her like waves. Those failures had seeded her belief that she could never truly conquer the daunting landscape of institutional authority. Yet, the faces of the children propelled her to rise again. They wouldn't let their stories fade into the background. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor reached for her phone. This time, it was not for reassurance from Dave. Instead, she dialed a former colleague, Tom, whose career had crisscrossed paths with the challenges of educational reform. If anyone could provide insight on strategic presentation, it would be him. Eleanor, he greeted, the warmth in his voice instantly easing her nerves. What's on your mind? Her next words felt heavy with all the stakes surrounding them. I need advice on presenting sensitive data to a board that is not exactly receptive to change. The conversation flowed. Tom's wisdom ignited a sense of clarity within her. He spoke about framing narratives, of elucidating the facts without compromising emotions. With every tip that he offered, Eleanor felt the knots in her stomach slowly unfurling, making space for clarity. It was about emotions and strategy, powerfully entwined in a single presentation aimed not just at persuasion but at truth itself. As she hung up, a new fire flickered to life in her chest. She couldn't ignore the truths she had passionately uncovered. It was time to harness their power. The whole boardroom dynamic would shift if she approached the presentation not merely as a confrontation but as a heartfelt call to action. But even then, an involuntary chill ran down her spine as she pondered the possible response from the board members, the entrenched opposition she might face. What if their retaliation was swift and ruthless? The resurgence of trepidation threatened to overshadow her newfound zeal. Determined, Eleanor adjusted her posture, straightening her back. She was not just an advocate but a vessel for the unheard. If she could embody their stories and allow their truths to resonate in every word she spoke, perhaps she could galvanize the change they sought. With renewed focus, she resumed drafting the presentation. Her heart thumped in rhythm with every keystroke, every sentence sculpting her destiny. Yet, deep within the tumult of her enthusiasm, a lingering question nagged at her. Was she truly ready to transform the anguish of these students into a weapon of hope? The approach of the board meeting loomed just days away, and Eleanor sensed the winds shifting radically. She was ready to embrace her role in the fight ahead, but would her bravery withstand the inevitable backlash? As the meeting date neared, Eleanor pondered the dizzying path she would navigate next. In the name of justice, how far was she willing to go before the tide of confrontation pulled her under? The moment of truth was drawing near, and Eleanor felt the stakes rising with every passing second. Eleanor awoke to the piercing trill of her alarm clock, its harsh sound slicing through the veil of sleep that clung to her. The day she had been anxiously counting down to was finally here. She sat up, the rays of morning light glancing through her window, yet the warmth that usually accompanied the sun fell heavy on her shoulders. She slid her feet into worn slippers and forced herself to shuffle into the bathroom, the floor's chill jolting her fully awake. As she stood in front of the mirror, steadying her breath, she picked apart her reflection. Why did it feel like the person staring back was a stranger in an unforgiving world? Shadows of uncertainty lingered under her eyes, but somewhere in the depths of those hazel depths, something flickered, a dormant determination ready to ignite. Today, everything she had staked on her belief in justice would either blossom or crumble. At the kitchen table, a robust cup of coffee offered solace against her racing heart. As she absent-mindedly skimmed through her presentation notes, she couldn't shake the specter of doubt hovering at the edges of her resolve. What if she faltered in front of the board? What if they dismissed her as just another emotional activist? But somewhere inside, anchored by the stories she carried, Eleanor harnessed a familiar strength. She closed her eyes, visualizing the faces of the children whose truth demanded to be heard. With each sip, her mind shifted from fear to focus. The strategy Tom had imparted echoed in her thoughts, facts framed with emotions, statistics woven into narratives. She needed to be not only an advocate but a storyteller, the bridge between the statistics and the lived experiences they represented. The pressure coiled tight within her, yet she welcomed it. It would push her to rise higher. The drive to the board headquarters felt longer than usual. The world outside rushed by in a blur of asphalt and impatience, mirroring her own internal urgency. As she navigated through traffic, Eleanor mentally rehearsed her opening lines, each word a calculated step into the lion's den. Upon her arrival, the austere building loomed above her, stark and intimidating. A rush of adrenaline fluttered in her chest as she stepped inside, greeted only by the sterile ambience of the boardroom. Stripped of her surroundings, the silence magnified her anxious thumping heart, but Eleanor steadied herself, recalling the importance of the mission ahead. When the board members filed in, Eleanor's pulse quickened. She raised her chin higher, presenting herself not just as a messenger but a fierce protector of those too vulnerable to speak for themselves. As the chairman began to introduce the meeting, she felt the eyes of the board on her, calculating, dismissive. She wrestled her rising apprehension back down into the recesses of her mind. Opening her presentation, she felt the warmth of conviction wash over her. The words began to flow, weaving together the statistics and stories in a way that painted a live portrait of their realities. With each data point, she punctuated them with a child's experience, a heartbeat pulsing through her words. She leaned into the unease of the room, challenging their preconceptions rather than courting their approval. Yet, just as the momentum surged, one of the board members interjected sharply, questioning her commitment to objectivity. The gleam in his eyes suggested he saw through her persona, hunting for any sign of weakness. Eleanor's stomach dropped, fear pulling darkly. The room felt colder. In that moment, she stood at a precipice. Should she retreat to the safety of facts, or stand resolutely in her truth? With a deep breath, she straightened her posture, reflecting on her purpose. "I am here for those whose voices have been silenced," she retorted fiercely, her own voice wavering with emotion but fueled by renewed conviction. The depth of her passion carved through their facade of indifference. But doubt still lurked just beneath the surface. Could she weather the storm of pushback looming before her? With her heart racing, Eleanor awaited the board's response, the tension thick. The moment hung like an unspoken echo, stretching into the unknown. Would they rally behind her call to action or retaliate against the challenges she posed? As she locked eyes with the chairman, Eleanor steeled herself for the battle ahead, understanding that fighting for justice would demand every ounce of courage she possessed. How far was she willing to go now that she'd crossed the threshold? It was time to face the repercussions of her bold stance, for better or for worse. Eleanor held her breath, her heart thrumming in rhythm with the ticking clock on the wall. The boardroom felt cavernous, shadows pulling in the corners, amplifying her isolation amid the layers of skepticism surrounding her. She braced herself for the tidal wave of responses that might come her way. The chairman, a graying man with an air of authority, interjected with a measured tone that belied the intensity of the scrutiny in his eyes. "Your emotional investment is commendable, Eleanor, but we must remain objective. How do you reconcile your approach with the need for impartiality in our findings?" His words bore the weight of a question laced with challenge. In that instant, Eleanor's mind raced, passing through her emotions. This was more than a confrontation about her presentation, it struck to the core of who she was and why she had chosen this path. The desire for justice was deeply woven into her identity, not a mere tactic or an accessory to her arguments. She could feel the palpable tension coiling within her, but somewhere deep down, a newfound conviction simmered, rising above the ambient sound of doubt. Impartiality does not mean relinquishing the human element, she countered, finding strength in her voice despite its tremor. Facts lose their significance if we don't connect them to the lives they affect. Each statistic represents a child, a family grappling with hardship. I refuse to separate their stories from the data we discussed today. The boardroom was silent. Eleanor felt the weight of their gazes, their surprise palpable as they took in her passionate assertion. Yet she was acutely aware that this single moment, full of resolve, had transformed into a precarious threshold one step further into a landscape she might not fully control. Was she risking her professional integrity by being vulnerable? The chairman leaned back, a glitter of intrigue in his otherwise stoic demeanor. "You are advocating for a shift in our framework, something that could significantly alter our approach to the issues at hand." His tone was contemplative, provoking Eleanor to question if she was being tested rather than attacked. "I believe our responsibility extends beyond mere numbers," she elaborated, emboldened by the unexpected glimmer of engagement. "We have an ethical duty to present the whole truth, including our emotional connection to it. It should compel us to act, not just observe." The board members shifted in their seats, and she detected a flicker of acceptance from some, yet she knew this was merely the beginning. With every nerve ending still tingling in defiance, Eleanor realized she was not just confronting them, she was in an intense dialogue with herself. The act of articulating her beliefs was solidifying the moral foundation she had been grappling with for so long, pushing her to evolve beyond her self-doubt. Another board member raised a brow, igniting apprehension once more. "But what if our stakeholders do not share your sentiments? What if your approach alienates them?" Eleanor's heart quickened again, a familiar pulse of anxiety starting to weave through her veins. It was true, she had considered this scenario in her preparations, but hearing it articulated now felt like staring into the abyss of her fears. What if every single challenge pushed her further into isolation instead of bringing change? But she found herself standing taller, steadying her breath as her resolve surged. Then it will be our duty to educate them, to face that conflict bravely. If we shy away from the emotional truths, we simply perpetuate apathy. The room buzzed softly, members exchanging glances, ideas igniting like powder in a barrel. Eleanor's words hung in the air, an invitation to the board, a challenge for them to examine their own resistance. Yet as their murmurs transformed into a hesitant dialogue, the clarity of her intent sharpened through the nebulous doubts. Every second spent in this room was also a moment of growth for Eleanor, an evolution she could finally embrace. She realized there was power in her vulnerability, a strength in showcasing her passion even if it could risk dismissal. But the ripple effects were uncertain. Would they find her approach illuminating or merely a nuisance? Eleanor's mind raced ahead, mapping possibilities and the paths of acceptance or censure. She could feel herself at the edge of a new promise. This battle was just a precursor to a much larger war. As she prepared to navigate through the board's reactions, a different kind of clarity emerged in her mind. She would fight not just for the children but for her own emerging identity as a leader. And as she awaited their response, she felt a flicker of something greater waiting to be unleashed, a shift that was far from complete. What revelations would unfold as she pressed on in this pivotal moment? Would the board rally to her cause, or would this be just the start of navigating an even more complex labyrinth of truths and trials? Eleanor remained poised as the board members' murmurs intensified, the air thick with anticipation. She sensed a subtle shift. The atmosphere was electric yet fraught with uncertainty. Every eye scrutinized her, dissecting not only her presentation but also her conviction. Eleanor felt every heartbeat hammer against her ribcage, striking a steady rhythm that anchored her thoughts. She recalled the countless hours she'd spent preparing for this moment, researching data, crafting narratives, and reflecting on her own experiences as an advocate. As a child, she had watched her mother fight for the rights of the disenfranchised in their community, a lesson etched in her mind. Here she was, seeing echoes of that determination emerge within herself, but surrounded by seasoned professionals who had long since fortified their beliefs. "The way you frame this issue is bold," said a woman with silver-streaked hair, lowering her brow as if weighing each word. "Impassioned speeches can inspire, but they can just as easily alienate those who prefer a more clinical approach." Eleanor chewed the inside of her cheek, the tension pulling at her focus. This wasn't the first time she'd faced skepticism. She thought of several projects in the past where her emotional perspective had been regarded with condescension. Yet she'd learned then that dispassionate logic could leave critical narratives unheard. "I understand the concern about alienation," Eleanor responded, her voice steady but animated with passion. "But if our stakeholders are only presented with the stark facts, aren't we just viewing a lifeless image? Our role isn't just to inform, it's to engage and move people to act." The board listened, some nodding in reluctant agreement while others exchanged glances that spoke volumes even within silence. The dichotomy of perspectives in the room ignited a fire within her, igniting both fear and exhilaration. Was she truly prepared for the possibility of resistance? A man sitting across the table, his fingers steepled, finally spoke, breaking the tension. "You claim that connecting emotionally is vital. But how do you ensure that this connection will hold up in the face of opposing views? What is your strategy moving forward?" Eleanor's eyes flared, the challenge invigorating her resolve. She had anticipated such questions. By fostering a dialogue. Inherent in our findings is the responsibility to provide context. I propose workshops that include narratives from those affected. Real stories will bridge the divide. It's how we transform skepticism into understanding. A collective stir accompanied her suggestion. The board began to exchange ideas, and Eleanor sensed that passion resonated beyond her solitary frame. Progress was tangible, but uncertainty still swirled. Would they embrace this new direction, or would they dismiss it as an emotional outburst? Her thoughts danced around incremental victories as she took mental stock of every conversation she'd had, every sacrifice she'd made to reach this pivotal moment. But there is something else, too, she added, feeling an unexpected urge to reveal a deeper truth. In order for me to craft a framework that is as impactful as possible, I need the courage to walk into the unknown. Eleanor's voice softened, drawing on her vulnerability as a bridge. I've learned that silence is complicity, and I want to create an environment where my colleagues feel empowered to share their truths, even if they differ from mine. The reactions were varied. Some faces displayed contemplation, others hesitance. The clock ticked relentlessly, each second amplifying the gravity of her words, but beneath the surface churned the quieter, deeper realization that true growth often stems from uncertainty. As conversations morphed into debates, Eleanor felt the crowd's pulse shift back and forth, each moment ebbing and flowing with her words. What had started as an uphill battle began to feel like a collaborative quest, but the stakes climbed higher with every moment. Eleanor straightened her back. Behind her public confrontation, conviction strengthened. She no longer doubted the value of what she brought to this table, but she embraced the fullness of her emotional and professional landscape. I can no longer allow fear to dictate how I communicate, she concluded, glancing around the room. I am ready to lead a transformation, one that cannot afford to sideline the human element. Would this newfound confidence propel her beyond limits she once accepted? As she gauged the board's reaction, she felt the anxiety shift, a mixture of optimism and caution taking root. But just as the board was beginning to embrace her vision, the door swung open. A latecomer entered, their presence a jolt. All eyes turned, curious about the intrusion. Who was this unexpected guest, and would they side with Eleanor's risk of emotional investment or derail everything she had worked hard to establish? The newcomer stepped into the room, exuding a mix of authority and familiarity. Dr. Sylvia Harris, the head of the school district's ethics committee. Eleanor's heart leapt at the sight of her. Dr. Harris was known for her unwavering stance on transparency and accountability throughout the educational system. Perhaps her arrival could tilt the scales finally in Eleanor's favor. As Dr. Harris took her seat at the table, Eleanor felt a rush of relief wash over her. This was the very ally she had hoped would emerge. Could this be pivotal in validating her mission? The murmurs in the room subsided as the board turned their attention toward her, the air thick with anticipation. Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Harris said, her tone calm yet firm. I've been made aware of today's discussion, and I must emphasize the critical need for accountability at every level of our educational system. I'm here to support Eleanor's call for a more emotive and human-centered approach. Eleanor's resolve strengthened as Dr. Harris continued. We've seen firsthand how neglect of emotional narratives has damaged lives. Eleanor's desire to weave personal stories into the broader fabric of data isn't just innovative, it's essential. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions revealing the slightest crack in their previous skepticism. Eleanor felt an electric thrill course through her. It was as if a powerful tide had shifted, lifting her spirit with renewed hope. This was her moment, not just for herself, but for every student like Tom who deserved better. With each word, Eleanor felt herself becoming the very advocate she had always yearned to be. These children are more than statistics, they are voices wanting to rise above the noise of indifference. By amalgamating our findings with their experiences, we can create the change that has long been overdue, she asserted. The atmosphere became charged, the board no longer just spectators but stakeholders in the shared vision. Eleanor's passion lit a fire beneath them, a transformative glimpse at the potential for change. In that case, we should explore setting up those workshops, one board member conceded, his voice steady but hesitant, as if weighing the gravity of the commitment. Eleanor, How would you guide us in incorporating these narratives into our framework? Eleanor took a deep breath, pushing aside the tendrils of doubt that still clung. We'll curate workshops that allow students and families to share their stories directly. This will not only humanize the data but also build an avenue for empathy. It will be a working space for people to understand how policies affect real lives, how neglect has lasting consequences. Dr. Harris nodded enthusiastically. A coalition of educators, parents, and accountability advocates can come together to bring change. Transparency doesn't need to instill fear, it can invigorate our system. As conversations erupted around her, Eleanor felt not only part of a team, she felt like a leader. The board's walls, once fortified with dismissal, began to crack and reveal a willingness to engage. As she shared her strategies for outreach, the room buzzed, oscillating between enthusiastic dialogue and a contemplative acceptance of responsibility. Moments flickered past in a haze of connection. Eleanor's voice resonated, her vision shaping into reality. The board's dynamics shifted gradually from one of skepticism to authentic engagement. Each question they posed now felt like a stepping stone rather than a challenge. Their fears transformed into a collaborative pathway forward. And it was in that moment, as the tides of the meeting turned toward action steps and in-depth dialogue, that Eleanor fully grasped her own evolution. She had gone from a grieving widow clad in shadows to a vibrant leader in the fight for justice. This was no mere confrontation, it was a movement, her voice transformed into a powerful rallying cry. As the meeting drew to a close, Eleanor's heart soared at the sound of unanimous agreement among the board to move forward with her proposed workshops. They were not just willing to make her an ally in advocacy, they were now advocates together. Leaving the boardroom, Eleanor felt as if she stood at the crest of a landscape rich with promise. She had stepped into her power not merely as a survivor of loss but as a beacon of possibility. This is the moment to show your support. You need to subscribe now to not miss the next exclusive emotional stories that will inspire you. Leave a like now to feed the algorithm and let others discover these journeys. Don't wait even one more second to share this video with at least 5 friends who need to see this conclusion and join the conversation. Comment below with your reactions and theories about this transformative ending.